Hey, you guys, just have a quick intro today before the podcast begins. In today's episode, I speak with Simon Manning of Bevel, which is a company based primarily in Seattle, and they provide consulting, training, support, and custom VR, AR experiences designed with the building industry in mind. And I think that you'll see in our discussion, we go into some depth about how VR and AR are disrupting, or at least potentially disrupting, the AEC industry. And in particular, I think it's a good conversation if you've been wondering, what industries other than gaming and entertainment is VR poised to disrupt. So I really enjoyed the conversation. We did have a less than perfect audio situation in certain parts of the podcast, but overall it's still very listenable. I hope you enjoy it, and without further ado, I give you Simon Manning. Hi everybody, welcome to the Synthetic Native Podcast. I'm here with Simon Manning, and I'm going to go ahead and just pass it right off to you, Simon, to talk about what you do, who you are, and all that good stuff.
Thanks. So, my background is architecture, and I went to school for it, and I came out here to Seattle to practice it. And um, when this sort of wave of VR, like once it became affordable, this kind of latest wave hit, I just kept everywhere I looked in the practice of architecture. I kept seeing ways that it would aid the process, speed things up, make things. My background was actually building physical models, and so I kind of saw how long it took and how much energy that went into trying to help communicate with the client. And VR just seemed to streamline that whole process.
Yeah, VR makes it. It's just, I guess, to put it simply, VR is in a way cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cheaper, faster. The kind of triangle of service that people draw a lot. You can have it cheap, you can have it fast, and you can have it good. Pick two, but you can never have all three. Well,
Right.
VR seems like the first step towards having all three. I mean, we can with interaction engines like Unity and Unreal, we can quickly create high quality experiences that help us make decisions much more informed. So, especially when we're talking about an architect who spent years thinking about floor plans and what that means spatially, they can kind of imagine this in a certain way. But a lot of times when they're dealing with, let's say, healthcare professionals, their profession has not kind of built those skills, and so with VR, we can kind of put everyone on the same page, and they don't have to make these leaps of imagination to understand what their day to day life is going to be like in their new hospital wing. They can just see it and they can react to it naturally as if they would on the day it's built. But the thing is, because we can do it early in the design process, we don't have all those costly mistakes of when they see it and react to it the day that it's built, and then we have to go back and change everything. That's kind of where VR comes in. Is we get that feedback earlier in the process and easier and faster.
Yeah, you can just make high fidelity prototypes quicker.
Yeah. Because the current way they do it is they'll rent warehouses and build one-to-one mock-ups in cardboard or plywood. And I mean that a lot of times these practitioners, like let's say you're a heart surgeon and they're building an operating room, they need your feedback. Well, you have to take time out of your busy schedule. Let's say a 3-day design event where you have to drive out of town for the whole day so that you can walk around this big warehouse where they've built all these operating rooms and give
Yeah.
your feedback. Well, with VR, we can set up a studio and a conference room, and then that person can just walk down the hall, weigh in for 5 or 10 minutes when their input is needed, and then get back to work. And it's not this huge burden on them. So
Okay.
that kind of process is streamlined as well.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with this. In this scenario where people walk into these warehouses, what is like an example of a problem that they would be like, oh yeah, this is wrong. Like this needs to change.
So an example that I went through was there were they were designing this laboratory in kind of a wing of this clinic, and they were saying, well, right now the lab is, let's say, 10 feet wide and 30 feet long. There's a couple columns inside that space, so altogether it feels really cramped. Like it feels like this hallway that you're kind of wheeling carts through and stuff. So it just seemed really cramped. And they've built all of this in cardboard so we could stand inside of it and feel that. And so they said, okay, well, let's move this wall, 5 feet over, and we'll have so much more room in here, and it'll feel great. Well, then we leave, and then 2 weeks later, when they've built this sort of like adjusted the large mock-up, we all come back. We find that, yeah, this lab feels great, but then the room on the other side of it, the locker room, when it has 5 feet less space in it suddenly, it's unusable. Like they can't even get in and around and stuff. So, but the thing is, it took us 2 weeks to make that decision.
Right.
With VR, um, that's the kind of thing that they're trying to address is like spatial needs. Like a lot of times they'll build everything in cardboard so that they can wheel in real gurneys through the hallways and see if like corner radiuses are enough that they can get around safely, and certain things like visibility studies to make sure that if I'm walking into a clinic, um, do I know where to go? Can I see the signs? Can I read them? But all of this stuff can be simulated with VR, especially the newer headsets that are coming out. I mean, every day we're getting closer and closer to being able to just simulate these environments anywhere and cheaply and quickly.
What are the applications that you use to like you don't like how do you what application are people firing up in a Vive or a Rift or whatever to actually explore these environments?
So there's a few different things that we use. One of them that is kind of come up more and more recently is actually an off the shelf product called Iris Prospect. It's kind of a CAD to VR tool set, but it works for a bunch of different softwares, so like SketchUp and things like that. But you can quickly and easily get these projects rendered simply and efficiently in this tool. And they support things like multiplayer, so we can get as many headsets as we want and get these people into it. So like that kind of direction is really appealing because there's very little overhead for that, so we can kind of do it on a moment's notice. But then for things like I mentioned before with the like MRI scan or something like that, like simulating something where we'll bring it into Unity or Unreal and we'll create kind of a packaged executable. And we try to make them generic enough that we can kind of find real value that we can reuse from project to project. But a lot of times at this stage, just because we're so early on, it's a lot of like creating it specifically for this client for this project.
Yeah.
And those are in game engines. But
Yeah. And okay. And so how many people are at Bevel?
there's three of us.
Okay. There's three of y'all, and who's kind of like the 3D artists?
Logan and I are both pretty proficient with 3D modeling. Just being like we both have architecture backgrounds. I'd say Logan is much more on the technical and coding side of things. Whenever we're doing like Unity projects, he's coding everything in C sharp and making sure everything is optimized. Whereas my background is more like architecture visualization. So I have a lot of 3D modeling background and a lot of like visual polish kind of stuff. So I also have proficiency with Unreal. So when we're working with clients, some of them will prefer one or the other, just based on like what they've heard or what someone on their team works with. And so it's nice to be able to kind of put on a different hat depending on what projects we're working with. And then Merritt is incredible. She like organizes everything and makes she's like the structure that we kind of work within. But her background is more law. So,
Why would somebody prefer Unreal versus Unity?
I think there's a perception of visual fidelity that which I think is like kind of an age old thing. Like if you want something really beautiful, you go with Unreal. But if you want something that, let's say plugs into a lot of different platforms, or if you want the diversity of content, you go with Unity. But honestly, I mean, we've done some really nice work with Unity, and Unreal blueprints are kind of how I got into coding because of how diverse and kind of creative you could be with programming. So I think we just try to be agnostic to it, or at least nimble enough. I mean, if we had a ton of, we're looking into things like Amazon's browser based AR/VR engine,
Sumerian?
Sumerian. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to get Kyle Roach to come on the podcast and talk to me about it.
Oh, awesome.
He's the engineering manager for that project at Amazon. So it's kind of a sidebar, but I know that it's funny. The people that work at these larger companies sometimes have trouble doing stuff like podcasts and even going out and speaking and stuff because they have so much red tape to jump through,
Yeah, that
And
was kind of my issue with my old firm versus going out into Bevel was architecture is kind of siloed in that way too. This is almost seen as like competitive advantage stuff, but at the same time, it's such a universal tool that was kind of what brought Logan and I together was the idea of VR being something that we hoarded versus something that we all kind of share, and rising tide raises all ships kind of thing.
yeah. What do you think about? So this is almost unrelated to all the XR architecture stuff, but since we're talking about it, what do you think about people kind of being able to represent themselves outside of their company, like what we just talked about? Like, like you're obviously at a small company now that you co-founded. Um, do you enjoy all of the freedom that comes with that?
Yeah, freedom is a good word for it because I've almost caught myself a few times too. So like kind of being too forthcoming. um, now that I've kind of formed my own entity, intellectual property becomes a thing that I'm a lot more aware of. So I think that was kind of a shift for me. But at the same time, I think we like ZGF in particular is really good about it as far as having they have these like specialists, these people that are experts. These guys, like for example, are circadian lighting experts and how light affects our brains. And they go out all over the world and speak because they have the ability to kind of develop this stuff further and share that knowledge. And then they get tons of feedback and then it kind of grows the industry. It's just that certain things kind of there are certain perceptions that things are worth more or like more competitively valuable than others, and that's where it gets kind of murky. At least as far as where like my past was, where it was just like it was fine for me to go and speak publicly about VR and architecture and all these things. But then if a particular competitor were to ask me like for coffee or something, then it was suddenly kind of like potentially an issue or something. So there were things where it was just kind of murky and ambiguous. And so now that I've founded Bevel, it's really refreshing to just have full accountability with all of my team. There's no, we're small enough right now that there's no bureaucracy as, and that part is definitely very, very freeing.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about, and stop me if I'm, mentioning something you can't talk about or whatever, but let's talk about like kind of what stage of company Bevel is. Like, do you guys have, like VC funding, or where are y'all at?
We're in this kind of interesting place. So first of all, geographically, we're split between Seattle and Portland, and so a lot of times we kind of um, meet online either in VR or over Discord and things like that. And then so individually in our different locations, like I'm a member of CoMotion Labs here in Seattle, so that's
Right.
kind of where I work out of,
Yeah.
and and I'm constantly surrounded by angel investors and venture capital people kind of coming through and scouting out all of the startups that are kind of blooming in CoMotion. Totally amazing place, by the way. And yet we are kind of a service industry business right now. We're kind of we're working on kind of tools and things that are reusable and packageable, but primarily we're trying to make things as easy as possible for architecture firms and construction companies and healthcare companies to dive into VR and start using an AR and start using these tools in their process. So we're kind of focusing on service at this point, and that is not at all appealing to venture capital, at least that we've found. So because we're able to kind of do these small projects and we're a small kind of nimble team, we've just been bootstrapping this whole time, and I think that we can just kind of grow organically because we can kind of compartmentalize and chunk down our offerings so tightly. Um, we're trying to make it as kind of easy as possible to integrate into the industry without risk or worry, because that seems to
Yeah.
be something that architecture and construction industry is very risk averse.
Yeah. By the way, sorry, I think I might have misphrased that. I didn't mean to imply that the only path to like a good or successful business is, venture
Oh
capital.
yeah,
Um,
no
I was just
worries.
throwing that out as an example. I do happen to talk. I mean, I work at a startup, and for the past 2 years, and I do interact with a lot of people from that
Mhm.
sphere. So it's probably just at the forefront of my mind as far as
Oh
business
yeah,
models and stuff.
and it's totally viable, and it really, especially around VR, there's a lot to offer when it comes to scalability and building tools and building sort of these software packages.
Right.
That's not really where we're at this point. We're trying to kind of make it, just because we come from an architecture background and we see how wary they are of new process and change the kind of the way that they've done things, because that's a big risk for these AEC companies,
Yeah.
because their
What's AEC?
service, sorry, architecture, engineering, and construction.
Okay. Cool.
It's yeah, and it's a really really interesting kind of industry to be in, because it's so focused on kind of resiliency over time and like of a process, and not kind of jumping from the to like from fad to fad, kind of the latest new thing, which is why it's been so much of a struggle to kind of get people on board with VR, is because it does have this sort of history to it of, oh, it's been around before, and it'll come and go and all of these kind of things. We're just trying to take the worry and the risk out of it, and so that just leads us to service for the short term.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about what the process is for, like, who comes to you? Who are your usual clients, and what does the process look like of kind of starting to work with them?
Our usual clients, are kind of like mid to large size architecture firms,
Okay.
just because they have kind of the budgets to dive into these things without feeling like it's a huge risk, but also because they work on these large scale projects. So there's a lot of savings whenever we plug into, say, a healthcare project. We can save them around like 70 grand per event, like per 3 day little VR event. We can save them tons and tons. So they're really interested in kind of seeing this impact their process more. But going about that is kind of a long process. A lot of it right now is based on our own network of people that I've worked with personally in Logan and Merritt. Um, but as far as like bringing in new customers, it's really one of those things where the moment that we show them what we can do, it's kind of a no brainer at this point. Um, it's more just a matter of kind of getting the headset on people, and
Yeah.
doing that from a distance is next to impossible sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's funny the parallel there with the showing the customer the technology and just showing an individual who doesn't understand VR, XR. As soon as they put on the headset and it kind of comes together for them, and they have this eureka moment, right?
hmm hmm The
Um,
thing I like about it is once you have the headset on, there's nothing to understand. You kind of
mhm.
go back into this mode of I'm just going to interact with what's around me. It's not like which button do I press. I mean, it can be for sure, at least at this early stage. But I like how VR becomes it kind of moves the technology to the background. We can focus more on like the whatever we're trying to learn from this.
Right. Is there anything you're on that note? Is there anything other than the work that you do? Is there anything that particularly excites you in VR or technology right now?
Well, I'm really interested in the capabilities of these next gen headsets, and particularly around inside out tracking.
Hmm.
We've done some experiments with Windows mixed reality headsets and some like backpack PCs
Hmm.
out in like a park, and the tracking was really spotty. But at the same time, like when it was working, it was a magical experience. Like being able to just like walk freely and not worry about teleporting and thinking about that kind of stuff
Yeah.
with VR. Like I'm really interested in seeing how big we can get these and how closer we can kind of blend the two with mixed reality, because I think that's really going to be where the magic happens, is looking at something. And I mean, we were even looking at we were talking to this construction company that needed to communicate to their different workforce around the world in like with whatever language barriers there may be. And so it was like sort of a visual sketching kind of construction app where we could
Right.
just show them like, you know, well, this was more of a concept stage, but it was like being able to demonstrate what like the studs were supposed to look like on this wall, whether you could communicate with them or not. You could just pin it with ARKit. You could just pin it in place, and they could see exactly what they needed to do, and they could just do it. So the idea of like communicating with mixing digital content into reality is really interesting to me.
Yeah. What do you think about Magic Leap?
I'm really excited to try out the hardware. I'm curious to see what it can do. But
Yeah, I think
yeah,
I guess nobody has a demo kit for that yet, right?
I not no one that I know at least. I imagine that CoMotion will probably be really noisy about trying to get some hardware. They tend
Mhm.
to. There was like a mountain of Windows mixed reality headsets one day. You walk in, it's just like to the ceiling. So hopefully there's something like that with Magic Leap, and I'll let you know. But until then, it looks exciting, and I can't wait to actually see what the differences are between that and say like the Hololens and that
Yeah.
kind of technology. So
Yeah,
excited.
please let me know. And if you get it, you got to come on again and talk about the experience. On the topic of co-motion, For people who don't know, that is a incubation. It's an incubator at the University of Washington here in Seattle, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And I think actually a couple of the other guests on this podcast, I think Eugene Kappan and I want to say I'm blanking on his name, but somebody else was from that lab as well. Um, d- do you know on a national scale? Do you know of any other? Because that's a very like VR focused incubator, right?
Well, it's actually it has kind of branches. So
Okay.
there's sort of a biotech branch. There's a IT branch, and then I think the most recent one is this AR/VR branch.
Okay.
And it's just sort of when I went there, I was kind of a kid in a candy store. It's like every conference room has Vive setups, and there's mixed reality capture studios and stuff, and they just do a really good job of providing all of the resources, both like equipment like that, and like the mixed reality stuff, but also like mentorship and the stuff that us budding entrepreneurs don't actually think about when we leave our cushy jobs, and we're like, oh, there's actually all of this business side of things, and startup, like all of the pitfalls that are before us, and they're really good about kind of connecting people in that way. So it's kind of a cool combination because they don't, it's just sort of a monthly subscription co-working space,
Hmm.
but with the backing of this large research institution of UW, and all of the resources that come with that. So it's kind of a neat space.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think I had I think I saw you in a picture of you and somebody from Rec Room or from Against Gravity on
Oh
uh
yeah.
on Instagram. I had Sean Whiting, their community manager,
Oh yeah,
uh,
he's great.
community designer, on the podcast a couple episodes ago. Can you talk about what you were doing there, or is that top secret?
No, it's more of a side project. That was Terrence Tolman. He's the concept artist over there.
Uh huh.
We're just working on this kind of arcade puppet alternative controller video game. It's a really long story, maybe for another podcast. But we were just there, kind of brainstorming, and it kind of meeting up and studying like the design of the construction of the pieces that we're building for this. It's sort of a puppet theater arcade game.
Got it.
It's yeah. So I went over there, and we were kind of sketching through things and working through it. But those guys are great. Rec Room. We actually use Rec Room for meetings at Bevel. They have the kind of clubhouses that you can set up. So we have
Uh huh.
these like persistent whiteboards that we'll use, and just kind of set up, just because they make the whole multiplayer, like let's meet up at a time and a place, really easy.
Uh huh.
So that's just one of the different social VR things that we kind of use, because it's really easy to go from a long business meeting to I'm kind of tired of talking about this stuff. Let's run over to Quest and like work,
Yeah,
go for
that's
the Crystal Cauldron or something.
that's cool. I still haven't done any of their like quest stuff.
Oh, they're great.
They're great. Okay, I'll have to do it. It's funny that you do that, and instead of using like I guess a more dedicated, just VR teleconferencing application.
We kind of experiment with all of them. One of the services that we provide our clients is this sort of consulting, and so part of it is we test software like Roomy and AltSpace and High Fidelity and these different kind of social VR applications, just so that we have a good idea of when a client comes to us and they ask for things like this, we have at least some experience to draw off of. But yeah, it's just kind of part of the process is keeping an ear to the ground for all of this.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard of. Is it Rumi, Rumi, or Rumi?
Rumii.
Okay, interesting.
Um,
So it's a play on the like the Persian poet or
yeah,
whatever. Okay.
yeah. It's essentially just a virtual meeting space. And yeah, I mean, you can kind of set up your own. Like we have a Bevel space that's persistent that we kind of meet in, and you can do kind of 3D sketching, tilt brushy kind of stuff, or load in your own FBX files and stuff like that. Um, and then we kind of experiment with others, because really the key is like how much can we customize the environment? How much can we like add our own flair to it, or load in the models that we need to look at? So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of what our guides our decision making for what kind of tools we use. Rec Room's more on the lighthearted side.
Right. You can't like so can you actually load up your models and view them in real time in something like Roomy?
Yeah, in Roomy you can bring in you kind of similar to Tilt Brush, you have like a folder in your computer that you can drop in your files to, and then
Right.
in Roomy you can kind of like load them up, and they'll sort of appear on the ground, and you kind of move them around, or if you have like animated FBXs and stuff, you can pause and play them. So it's pretty neat, but at the same time, we're kind of, if we're meeting that way, if we're studying something like architecture, we'll use something like Iris, where it's dedicated, it's focusing on like loading an architecture model and then us meeting in it, as opposed to loading like this high fidelity like meeting room with all of these textures and materials and things that take away from the performance of these, like, because usually with architecture models we're pushing the limits of performance because they're
Okay.
just so big and detailed and complicated, and
Right.
we don't have the option of a lot of the sort of tricks of the video game industry.
Right. And speaking of video game industry, do you have any thoughts or comments on sort of how the gaming industry is driving innovation in VR and how and now it's starting to breach out into like what you're doing? Like I think it's fair to say, and tell me if I'm wrong, that your ability to work in architecture and construction is owes something to the gaming industry.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I we standing on the shoulders of giants for sure, for like graphics rendering capabilities, all of that stuff for sure. And then now with Unity and Unreal, it's been a game changer. Not to, I guess, no pun intended.
Right.
Um, I think they've been focusing for so long, that industry, on real time performance and interaction and all of these things that come together to just create these worlds. And architects until recently have kind of um, they've made that kind of a process that happens within their mind, and kind of that communication has always been done with 2D drawings. And so I think now that they're sort of learning from the gaming industry as far as like communicating an experience to someone that a space can give you, and like seeing how the tools that they've made to kind of streamline the production of those kind of experiences, it's been huge, and I think it's going to grow too. I mean, the things like Unreal Datasmith.
Mhm.
It's a plugin that allows Unreal to process CAD data, and it just chews up SolidWorks files and all kinds of stuff. So now people can start to render, like machine parts working in real time, and make those experiences interactive. I'm really excited to see where the game industry and the AEC industry sort of like blend and kind of cross pollinate, because so far it's been really exciting.
Yeah, and I think maybe I wonder if the gaming industry will also drive the eventual UX improvements that are going to be necessary to really um, improve adoption of VR technology. Because I don't know, gaming, more traditional gaming, I guess like console or PC gaming, non VR, has had so much time to give people these really really polished experiences. And then I think it's a stark contrast when you try some of these VR games and experiences where you're kind of fumbling with how to do locomotion and how to interact with objects, even with kind of bigger budget VR games. So, maybe they will solve some of those problems, and then that will make it, better for your clients. Like one thing I was going to ask was earlier, but I forgot was how do you do locomotion when folks are in uh, your your setups?
Yeah, so right now it's primarily sort of point and teleport.
Hmm.
Although that's why we're looking so heavily into Windows mixed reality and backpack PCs or wireless, is because we want to eventually make it no teleport. We can just simulate these kind of these large experiences in a large space. But I think right now there is a learning curve for that kind of point and click, and suddenly you're in a new place. It's kind of amusing to see people try to get around, and some people just immediately get it. They're flying all over the place. I did a project for a client that involved, they were kind of, it was like a discovery day for their employees, and we were showing like hundreds of people their a VR experience of their new office campus. And just so I was like putting the headset on, like 100 people an hour is basically what it was.
Hmm.
And some people would just run into a wall and then give up, because it would just be like a blank white surface, and they just had no idea why they couldn't see anything, or what the problem was. Whereas other people, like, they were kind of walking all around the edge of the Vive space and kind of exploring the limits of this technology, and they kind of just intuitively grasped it. So
Yeah,
it was neat to kind of see the gamut. It's definitely going to take some time before it's mass market kind of prolific, but
yeah,
it's cool to see the transition.
yeah. I wonder, is there a correlation between people who game and then their ability to adapt to the VR controls?
Yeah,
There's got to be.
I think so, but I wonder if it would surprise us, because I've had a few friends that, at least with my DK2, back when we were first kind of getting into this stuff, they would just sit there looking perfectly straight ahead, and they would try to do everything with the controller. And I had to
Mhm.
remind them that they could look around and kind of explore the world. But I
Right.
think I think beyond that sort of initial expectation, I think eventually they'll be the ones that kind of, it's all about willing suspension of disbelief at this point. It's like a theater term, but the idea of like just going with the flow of like what the rules of the game are. I think gamers are better at that, of just kind of like accepting the reality that's around them.
Yeah. Can you talk about, like, in 10 years, if everything keeps developing swimmingly, what your kind of dream or aspiration for Bevel, companies like Bevel, and sort of VR and architecture, like what that would look like?
Yeah, 10 years of VR development. So like when it's at the iPhone X stage.
Yeah, maybe 10 years is a little ambitious because that's pretty far out, but
Yeah,
we could
let's
say
go
5 years.
Well, 5 years, hopefully this whole Magic Leap stuff goes well, and it's mostly distributed computing, like all of our, that's the goal for architecture, at least I see, is taking all of our CAD files and all of our spatial data, and getting that out into the world around us. It's trapped behind these 2D screens. Um, but that's going to take a huge leap of user interface innovation, and that's the thing that I'm kind of excited to see evolve over time. Is how do I mean I don't know if you've played with things like Masterpiece VR, or I mean there's Tilt Brush as well, but and like blocks, but trying to be precise and like kind of work at the scale that architects work, where they're kind of jumping in and out of tiny details and giant forms. Um, that's going to be the kind of the innovation, is like how do we interact with all of this spatial data that we now have. Like HoloLens is great, but I'm not going to be air tapping in 5 years. At least I hope not.
You're not going to be what?
Air tapping. That's like the HoloLens click is this sort of hold your hand out at arm's length and sort of tap your thumb and finger together. Um,
Oh, okay. Is that
when
really
you're looking,
awkward?
it's just it's not. I wouldn't call it very ergonomic. Um,
Okay.
it, you have to kind of hold your arm out extended for long periods of time, but you're aiming with your neck. But I mean, once eye tracking and things like that kind of innovate and get more integrated, which in the next 5 years will totally be a thing. I'm just really excited to see this whole idea of spatial computing and like what that means to have my computers not tethered to a physical spot that I go and sit down at, but spread across the world and kind of interactive spatially. Because I mean, architecture really is just the design of spaces. So if data suddenly becomes a new medium for us to design with, then I don't see why architecture wouldn't have like virtual or augmented reality facades and things like that. Um, like hopefully it won't be all for like Times Square style advertising, but more expressive of the design intent that the architects went for. But you know, you could do it
Yeah.
for free instead of $10 million for your custom facade. You could focus on sustainable practices and make it work for the performance of the building, but then be expressive in another way.
Yeah. So thanks for kind of giving your forward facing view. I have kind of a retro, not a kind of a past facing view
Mm-hmm.
question or a question about you. Why did you become an architect or what brought you to architecture?
I think it's interesting because when faced with real architecture, I immediately went a different direction. So
Mhm.
I think it's more kind of the ability of like making things. I've always kind of been a crafty kid, um, and then architecture seemed like the biggest craft, the biggest, because you really can dig into the details of it. And I think that how that led from kind of as I grew up with using Legos and Connects and things like that. I was always kind of building things, but what I didn't realize is the scale that I was comfortable with is very connected to that, like my body and like the human form. And so once I get into architecture, it became something that I couldn't really wrap my head around. It was kind of too big or too grand, and we would be designing things like skyscrapers or like big theaters and stuff like that. And I was always focusing on the inside and like kind of the space, the quality of the space, but I couldn't really. I just couldn't really wrap my head around it. What it would have felt like. And so when VR came around, it was kind of a natural step in that direction. It's like something that I've always been kind of frustrated with about myself, and like something that this technology could suddenly offer me.
So do you think what do you think is important about architecture in like a cityscape? Are you like when you go to a new city, are you checking out the architecture? Is that something that you care about?
Oh, definitely. I mean, now that it's one of those things. The more that you learn about things, the more that you can appreciate them, and at least for me. And so, having this long background of study of architecture, it's kind of revealed this richness to cities. And I really got into urban planning in particular. So, like I love the urban environment and going to new places and kind of seeing what's different about it.
Hmm.
If you haven't been, my recommendation is actually Vancouver, BC.
Hmm.
It's like something about it, the color coordination, seemingly of the city. It just seems like this science fiction sort of like blip on the map. It's pretty incredible. Um, the
Yeah,
whole
I
city,
wasn't I wasn't expecting it to feel as metropolitan as it did.
yeah, and you kind of like dive into the middle of the city on the, at least with the bridges and stuff. You kind of like fly in at halfway up the skyscrapers,
Uh-huh.
It's something about it just made me think of like Jetsons or something.
Yeah.
It's a neat town. Uh,
Yeah. I went there and I was like, this is not going to be as city like as Seattle. And I was like, actually, it feels
yeah, it's like
more
a
like a city.
well, what's interesting is, Vancouver, their zoning regulations mean that the blocks are smaller and the
Uh-huh.
building footprints are smaller and the heights are smaller, but the proportions remain the same. So
Uh-huh.
it seems like it's this sort of Manhattan, like this tiny, like micro New York, but the
Uh-huh.
buildings are half the height as well. So
Uh-huh.
it just has this really good density of Vancouver does some things really well as far as like living within the city and having like a good mix of things to do and places to eat, and places to live, places to work. That kind of mix. And I think
Uh-huh.
that's what leads it to feel so dense and metropolitan and that kind of vibrant city feeling. Uh,
Have you been to Houston, Texas?
yeah, but not downtown as much. I have some family that lives kind of out in the outskirts,
Okay.
40 miles from downtown, I guess.
I was just asking because they have like no zoning there. That's where I'm from.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, Simon, thank you so much. How can people contact you or find you?
You can find me at my either through my website www.bevel.space and or at any of the Seattle VR meetups or maybe on Rec Room one of these days.
Okay. So you're not a Twitter person?
My partner is, and we actually, yeah, he kind of handles the Bevel Twitter account. I think it's at Bevel VR.
Okay.
I may need to correct that later.
Okay, no problem. We'll put information down in the description. Thanks again so much, Simon. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, you guys, thanks for checking out today's episode with Simon Manning. I just wanted to give a couple quick notes before we end it all. That sounds dark. We're not going to end it all. Um, but if you're not already subscribed to us on YouTube, it would really mean a lot if you could search Synthetic Native on YouTube. I don't think there's any other channels competing for that name. So subscription on YouTube means a lot. We're also on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and a like or a follow would be great and highly appreciated. The other thing that you can do is if I missed anything in this podcast that you think that I should have touched on, if there's a question that I should have asked Simon, anything like that, if there are other people that you think I should speak with, if there's another industry that you think VR could be disrupting, anything like that, any comments, questions, concerns, suggestions would be really, really useful if you could reach out to us and let us know what your thoughts are on the Twitter, the Facebook, the YouTube. It doesn't matter, whichever one of those that you use. But yeah, in the meantime, thanks again for listening. It really means a lot, and I will catch you on the next episode.